Good day to all thinking people. You're on the Open Space YouTube channel. Today we have an extra episode of Rational Melancholy. That state when everything seems clear, but it doesn't make life any easier, and the depth of melancholy is measured by the degree of fatigue from the world around us. Let's go. A few days ago, last Thursday, Trump's 28-point plan to end the Russia-Ukraine war emerged and began to be discussed publicly. This outburst of naivete caused such a stir that the entire blogosphere, young and old, felt compelled to comment. After listening to a few particularly distinguished bloggers, our admin team also decided to tread on the skin of a Ukraine that hadn't yet been destroyed, but for some reason had already been divided into parts. Broadly speaking, the entire story of Rusty and his administration's so far futile attempts to end the war boils down to active pressure on Ukraine and rather weak pressure on the aggressor, the Russian Federation. So weak, in fact, that no tightening of sanctions, which weren't particularly effective anyway, or increase in military aid to Ukraine has been observed throughout his entire presidency. Consequently, the illusion is created that Trump is trying to sell out Ukraine. But it's just an illusion. In reality, things are worse. Rusty has surrounded himself with more than just unprofessionals. He's surrounded himself with people who will cling to their positions at any cost, who will please this frankly incompetent president even at the cost of their own reputational damage, the threat to the national security of the United States itself, and so on. If you recall, attempts to end the war using Trump's method began with the complete collapse of Ukraine and its allies' negotiating positions. The quality of these allies can be discussed endlessly, much like the quality of shit. But Trump stood out even against this backdrop. What you can't take away from Trump is his ability to drum into the minds of his highly intelligent voters that he is the greatest negotiator. And so this greatest negotiator is squandering the starting position for negotiations. Even before they begin, he is ready to recognize the annexation of Crimea as legal, legally ban Ukraine from joining NATO, lift sanctions, and so on. And all for the sake of stopping a truly bloody war, even the bloodiest in Europe in the last 80 years. How do negotiations even happen? Imagine a line with a zero in the middle. There's Party A's position, equal to minus X, and Party B's position, equal to plus X. These positions are often diametrically opposed. And so, during negotiations, the parties, by making concessions, gradually approach zero. What did Trump do? He stupidly shifted his position, the position of Ukraine and its allies, to a position close to zero, while the aggressor's position remained unchanged. The aggressor, represented by Putin, looked at this, shrugged, and continued to stand his ground, expecting Rusty to shift Ukraine's position even closer to that of the aggressor, simultaneously launching missile and bomb strikes against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, but more on that later. Even the Zedniks sat down after seeing this negotiating nonsense. They didn't expect Rusty to be so stupid or that fate would bestow such a gift upon them. As summer approached, the negotiating sluggishness worsened. Trump realized he could make money from peacekeeping. And not just make money, but also further placate his new best friend, Volodymyr Putin. In other words, having abandoned his initial negotiating positions, Trump found himself in a situation where, in order to force the aggressor to even discuss a ceasefire, for 3 days, a month, in any case, short term, he had to promise the aggressor not just the lifting of sanctions but also certain economic perks. Looking ahead, let's say that the insanity of these 28 points has led to the development of cooperation between Russia and the United States in the field of artificial intelligence. So that in 5 years, Russia will have qualitatively new means of warfare based on American technology, with which it will attack not only Ukraine, but also Europe and the United States itself. But Rusty doesn't think that far ahead. By the end of the summer, the position of the greatest negotiator of all time had shifted so much that the diplomatic blockade against Russia was effectively broken, and diplomatic relations with the United States were effectively fully restored. Back in the spring, the United States, along with Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and Eritrea, voted with the aggressor against a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the aggression against Ukraine, effectively declaring that Ukraine's allies supported the attack on Ukraine. But the apotheosis of diplomatic insanity was the meeting between Trump and Putin in Anchorage, where they shook hands, and his best friend Volodya was greeted by an honor guard and a flyover of military aircraft. One suspects that Rusty won't stop there and, to appease the aggressor, will begin supplying it with military aid. Now let's recall our negotiating line again. If on the day of Trump's inauguration, the zero was roughly in the middle, now it's not even between the two positions, but simply behind. And if on the third day of his presidency, Trump set Ukraine's position at zero, now it's somewhere between zero and Russia's position. And then, in the fall, something in the negotiator's head switched. He decided to impose sanctions. And for some reason, not against Ukraine, but against Russia. What sanctions? The same old restrictions against two more Russian oil companies. Meanwhile, the sanctions imposed earlier by the Biden administration are being implemented so effectively that they're not being implemented at all. Not because they don't want to, but because it's impossible to fully implement them. They're being circumvented too easily. You probably remember how pro-Biden media and bloggers went wild when Biden imposed his farewell sanctions, comparing Trump's inaction to the strength and power of old Biden. So where are all those bloggers now? Yeah, right. It unexpectedly turned out that sanctions against the oil industry are being evaded quite easily, and Russian oil is even being transported on tankers owned, among others, by Greek shipowners. For those unfamiliar, Greece is supposedly a member of the European Union, right? Trump, of course, has occasional lucid moments. For example, he quite rightly noted that the European Union still buys energy from Russia. And technically, he's right. But to what sources will Europe replace its energy imports? That's right, to American ones. And so we come to the only correct conclusion. All this fuss with sanctions against the oil industry is not about sanctions against Russia per se, but about redistributing the global oil market. It's all very simplistic, like everything Trump does. Tariffs, attempts to pressure trading partners, sanctions, and then a Swiss delegation brings Rusty a gold bar with an engraving, and Rusty lowers his tariffs for Switzerland to the pan-European level. But what about, tariffs are needed to restrict access to the American market so that domestic production can develop. You don't understand, that's different. But Trump has a characteristic that's typical of just such incompetent negotiators. He creates chaos, if you will, to which the other negotiating parties must somehow respond. This happened with the tariffs. Everyone in the world got all worked up. This also happened this year in the attempts to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Every time Trump makes some kind of threatening remark, usually directed at the victim of aggression, it triggers unrest in Ukraine and its European allies. Interestingly, Ukraine's position also undergoes certain metamorphoses. For example, by the end of 2025, no one in Ukraine or Europe is even thinking about restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. On the contrary, Zelensky and his European allies are unanimously declaring that we must stop at the demarcation line, recognize Russia's de facto, but not de jure, control over the captured territories, and leave the issue of restoring territorial integrity for later. A blunt proposal to lay a mine under future generations. The FRG has already experienced firsthand what happens when a territory and its population remain in the Russian world for an extended period. This is the territory of the GDR, which from 1945 to 1990 was not only effectively occupied by one of the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition, the USSR, but also the population there was brainwashed by communist ideology, its economic potential oriented toward cooperation with the countries of the socialist camp. And when German reunification occurred in 1990, the GDR effectively ceased to exist, but the joy of the reunification of a once divided people was not replaced by disappointment. Rather, it was a collision with reality. Like a car with a pole. The states that were part of the GDR remain the most economically underdeveloped to this day, resulting in a catastrophic age imbalance. All the young people are flocking to the industrialized states of the old FRG, leaving only the flabby old rabble in the former GDR who vote for the alternative for Germany, AfD, in the hopes that outright Nazis with Russian funding will help. No, not find the money for a complete overhaul of the entire economy, but with combating migrants and increasing benefits, read government freebies. The funny thing is that in the states of the former GDR, migrants are actually a minority. Migrants live where there is both work and money. And now Zelensky, Macron, Merz, and the rest of the Starmers are proposing something like the 1945 partition of Germany, forgetting that 80 years ago, it was the aggressor who had capitulated and lost everything, not the victim of aggression, who was being divided into spheres of influence. Therefore, the firmness displayed by both the Ukrainian leadership and its European allies is, of course, touching. And now, after all this insanity, a new scourge has befallen Ukraine. One devised not even by professional diplomats or anyone who's ever opened the UN Charter, but by the obscure real estate businessman Steve Witkoff and an equally shady figure, Kirill Dmitriev, CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. It's a real financial rim job, to say the least. It was mentioned earlier that Trump's goal is to redistribute the oil market in favor of the United States. But that's not all. Trump and his camp also have a very utilitarian goal: making money. This is precisely why negotiations to end the Russian-Ukrainian war are being conducted by two financial tycoons, meaning they are deciding where American money will be invested in the Russian economy and under what conditions. And in return, the aggressor won't have to eat its victim. It's all so simple. European and American companies left Russia, and the Russian government even robbed them for daring to leave. Now the situation has reached a point where neither Ukraine nor Europe can reverse the situation. There are not only contradictions on the level of morality and international law, but also financial, military, logistical, and transport issues. Too much money has been invested in kicking Russia out of Europe. They only forgot to kick out Russian tourists, but they are occasionally remembered. And then a third force, the United States, an ally of both Europe and Ukraine, mind you, wants to take advantage of the vacant niche in Russia and invest its money there. But not just the United States, but the businesses that revolve directly around Trump. And he, the red one, will decide who gets what. The money will be channeled into the Russian economy through the Russian Direct Investment Fund, headed by Kirill Dmitriev. And you might be surprised, but this is precisely why this fund was originally created. It co-invests in major economic projects. But in return, the US must do something: pause the Russian-Ukrainian war on terms favorable to the aggressor, so that after Trump's presidential term ends, it can return to a final solution to the Ukrainian issue, taking into account the mistakes of the previous attempt. But to be fair, it should be noted that the Ukrainian armed forces are indeed in dire straits. Apparently, Zelensky is living in some kind of delusional world regarding the current state of affairs on the front, which is why the U.S. Secretary of the Army personally came to him with 28 points to explain the real situation and what will happen next if Ukraine continues to resist. It should be noted here that Zelensky is certainly an impressive actor of the third rank, but he is a lousy politician and strategist. Therefore, all his decisions only worsen the situation. The latest one is allowing draft-age individuals to leave Ukraine. Previously, there was a ban on conscription. Our admin team is planning a podcast about the problems with the Ukrainian army, but for now, we will note that the only reason for the advance of Russian troops is the shortage of personnel in the Ukrainian army. Neither side has any technological advantage, both are fighting primarily with drones using Chinese components. But the US's influence on Ukraine may also be overestimated. After nearly a year of Trump's experiments with military aid, it's essentially boiled down to two levers: intelligence and the Pearl program for purchasing American weapons through Europe. There's also Starlink, of course, but in theory it could be replaced with European equivalents. However, the question remains as to how long it will take, and whether the front will collapse while they're replacing satellite dishes and reconfiguring equipment on the ground. In any case, Trump is openly pissing himself, directly abandoning Ukraine. Initially, he screamed about Ukraine ripping off the US, citing military aid amounts of around $300 billion, but ultimately, he managed to reduce everything to mere capitalist gain and begin selling weapons to Ukraine using European funds. And if he tries to ban even arms sales to Ukraine, it could be the beginning of his end as a political figure, not only his, but also the US as a reliable ally. The US is already behaving not just like a crappy ally, but like an entity profiting off its partners. For now, everyone is gritting their teeth, but dancing to their tune. For show. In reality, all of America's partners are developing their military-industrial complexes at a frantic pace, particularly advanced ones, though still secretly, but 100% conducting research into developing their own nuclear weapons. No one wants to rely on the US and its president's emotional roller coaster, given Ukraine's example. While our admin team was preparing this podcast, the circus continues, new details emerge, and we haven't even gotten to the actual analysis of the points of the ass-wound peace plan yet. A meeting of US, Ukrainian, and European delegations is already underway in Geneva, and the text of this nonsense has already been run through artificial intelligence language models, which revealed that the original was in Russian, translated, and presented as Trump's peace plan. To exonerate his boss, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has already said that Trump didn't author these points. And why, one wonders, is an entire Secretary of State currently discussing them in Geneva. Someone even leaked recordings of a phone call between Witkoff and Putin aide Yuri Yushchikov to Bloomberg, in which Witkoff advises Putin on the best way to suck up to Trump. And it's this mess that we'll now try to sort out. So, point 1. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. I'd love to laugh, but it seems inappropriate. Actually, Ukraine's sovereignty has already been confirmed. And it's been confirmed repeatedly by the aggressor itself in international treaties. The border treaty even bears Putin's personal signature. And Ukraine's sovereignty extends to all of its territory, yes, even the territory occupied and annexed by Russia, as well as to its army and its size. Point 2. A full and comprehensive non-aggression pact will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. All the ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered resolved. Are you serious? The Russian Federation is the sole culprit of everything that's happening. Therefore, there are no ambiguities and there never were. The US, however, is trying to present the situation as if innocent Russia was provoked, just like Hitler was provoked in 1939, according to his modern successor, Putin, to attack. It's ironic that before Russia committed an act of aggression against Ukraine back in 2014, no non-aggression pacts were required. Everyone was living happily and not preparing for any war, and the existence of the 1997 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between Ukraine and Russia somehow didn't prevent Russia from committing an act of aggression, annexing Crimea, and invading Donbass under the guise of protecting the Russian-speaking population. And now Putin and his followers in Russia will be directly enforcing the non-aggression pact. It's high time the international community realized that treaties concluded with Russia will inevitably be violated. Point 3. It is expected that Russia will not invade its neighbors, and NATO will not expand further. Given the above, this is simply a naive perception of reality. For anything to be expected from Russia, it must undergo qualitative changes at all levels of government, not the sham ones that took place in the 1990s, when, under the guise of democratic changes, it gained access to the global market, used the money to wage war in Central Europe, and ultimately descended into dictatorship. Our channel has, and will continue to have in the coming weeks, podcasts examining other options for achieving this expectation, either a forced or a voluntary, but controlled, disintegration of the Russian Federation. In this case, there will no longer be any possibility of invading neighboring countries. Ironically, Proposals for such an end to Russia are being voiced not by our admins, but by the fugitive Russian liberal opposition. Point 4. A dialogue between Russia and NATO will be held, mediated by the United States, to address all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation, ensuring global security and increasing opportunities for cooperation and future economic development. Notice that the United States will act as a mediator between NATO and Russia, as if the United States itself were not a NATO member. Here, it's worth recalling the formal pretext for Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2022. In December 2021, a demand was voiced for NATO to expel members admitted since 1997, and in January 2022, a certain Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, issued a downright diplomatic ultimatum. NATO needs to pack its bags and return to the borders of 1997. The diplomatic background of MGIMO is immediately apparent. Point 5. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. Generally, the word reliable is a loaded term and reflects a subjective perception of reliability criteria. For example, under the 2022 Istanbul non-agreements, reliable security guarantees for Ukraine, from the aggressor's perspective, were Russia's veto power over any military assistance to Ukraine from other guarantors of its security. Reliable? Well, for the aggressor, yes, because it had not abandoned its desire to subjugate Ukraine, and the next attempt at military invasion was not to be accompanied by outside assistance to Ukraine. But for Ukraine, these guarantees weren't even guarantees. Point 6. The size of Ukraine's armed forces will be limited, and then it's not entirely clear what the limitation is. The text states 600,000, but the number, 6, is in parentheses. So it could be 900,000, or it could be 100. In fact, the very question of limiting the size of the army contradicts the first point, which is a direct limitation on state sovereignty. In the case of Ukraine, which has been the victim of Russian aggression since 2014, there can be no limitation on the size of the army in principle. And if Zelensky is somehow forced to sign this, then this point will be violated the very next day, because the sole guarantor of the independence and territorial integrity of absolutely any state on this planet is that state's army. And absolutely all Ukrainian citizens understand this. Point 7. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its charter's provisions that it will not admit Ukraine at any time in the future. This was truly written somewhere in Moscow, and by frankly narrow-minded people. There is no NATO charter, there is the North Atlantic Treaty. But in any case, determining whether a state is neutral or not is the exclusive right of that state. And here lies another contradiction with the first point, an attempt to curtail in every way the sovereignty of the victim of aggression. More broadly, NATO was created as a counterweight to the USSR and its satellites, because small European countries alone were unable to resist it. So it turns out that they are trying to force Ukraine to agree to a lone confrontation with an adversary far superior in technology and manpower. A separate question is how exactly Trump intends to force all NATO members to ratify the amendment to the North Atlantic Treaty. And there are 32 of them. It has not yet been forgotten how Sweden and Finland joined for about 2 years, because Turkey and Hungary did not want to ratify the treaty on their accession. Point 8. NATO agrees not to deploy troops to Ukraine. That's the question. The point is, there are troops under NATO command, and then there are the national troops of NATO member states that are not under NATO command. Therefore, France and the UK can deploy their national troops to Ukraine, right? Point 9. European fighters will be stationed in Poland. But they're not stationed there now, are they? We're talking about a big top. Point 10. US guarantees. The US will receive compensation for the guarantees. If Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose the guarantees. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive, coordinated military response, all international sanctions will be reinstated, and the recognition of new territories and other benefits of this agreement will be revoked. If Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantees will be considered null and void. This is yet another mockery of common sense and international law. Not only will the US receive money for its mediation services, but they are also planning to play the game of recognizing or not recognizing Russia's sovereignty over the occupied territories of Ukraine. Spectacular. It's unclear what a decisive, coordinated military response means. Are the US going to war with Russia? Seriously? Then why didn't they enter the war earlier? Or is it necessary for the aggressor to seize what it has seized? Of course, the irony is particularly striking in the de facto permission for Ukraine to launch missiles at any Russian city except Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's immediately obvious who's at the bottom of the food chain. And what's stopping Russia from orchestrating another Ryazan blitz to deprive Ukraine of a key ally? Incidentally, a Ryazan blitz would even be beneficial to the US. They could simply abandon Ukraine and forget about it. As we've already said, we expect the US not only to supply military aid to the aggressor, but also to coordinate efforts to completely destroy Ukraine. Point 11. Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will receive short-term preferential access to the European market while this issue is being considered. This is despite the constant protests by farmers on the Polish-Ukrainian border over cheaper food exports from Ukraine, right? Right. Point 12. A robust global package of measures to rebuild Ukraine, including, but not limited to, the creation of a Ukraine Development Fund for investment in high-growth sectors, including technology, data centers, and artificial intelligence. The United States and Ukraine will cooperate in the restoration, development, modernization, and operation of gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. Cooperation is planned in the reconstruction of war-torn regions. This will allow for the rebuilding and modernization of cities and residential areas. Infrastructure development, extraction of minerals and natural resources. The World Bank will prepare a special financial package to accelerate these efforts. As usual, for everything good, against everything bad. Data centers on Ukrainian territory will be especially ironic, as under such a peace treaty, the next act of aggression will inevitably occur before 2030, but more on that later. Point 13. Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon in stages and individually. The United States will conclude a long-term economic cooperation agreement. It will cover areas such as energy, natural resources, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, data centers, rare earth metal mining in the Arctic, and other mutually beneficial business projects. Russia will be invited to rejoin the G8. Yes, Russia needs to recover as quickly as possible and attack another country. At the same time, it needs to transfer advanced technologies to China, which it will then sell to China and gain a competitive advantage in the future war to reclaim Alaska. The internet attributes the phrase to Churchill, "Americans can be trusted to do the right thing when all other options have been exhausted." Truly, amen. We all wait for the United States to finally get its just desserts for its utter stupidity. Point 14. The frozen funds will be used as follows. $100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be allocated to US-led reconstruction and investment projects in Ukraine. The US will receive 50% of the profits from this project. Europe will allocate an additional $100 billion to increase investment in Ukraine's reconstruction. The frozen European assets will be unfrozen. The remaining frozen Russian assets will be invested in a separate joint US-Russia investment fund. This fund will implement joint projects in specific areas. Its goal is to strengthen relations and expand common interests in order to reduce the risk of a return to conflict. Well, nothing changes here again. The US plans to make money by severing economic ties between Russia and Europe, replacing the latter in the Russian market. The US is, of course, a lousy ally. And reducing the risk of conflict through investment is a repeat of the same old story. In the 1990s, they saved Russia from starvation, only to have a war now. Point 15. A joint US-Russian working group on security issues will be established. It will facilitate and monitor the implementation of the agreement's provisions. Point 16. Russia will enshrine in law its non-aggression policy against Europe and Ukraine. Budagashenka. For those unfamiliar, Russian law currently explicitly prohibits attacks not only against Europe but against any country in general. The Russian Criminal Code contains Article 353, planning, preparing, unleashing, or waging an aggressive war, and the sentences there are hefty, from 7 to 20 years. Even after the war began in 2022, this article wasn't removed from Russian national law. Instead, they began to silence the Russian rabble, preventing them from uttering the word war again, lest an overzealous prosecutor demand Putin's arrest. But the rabble quickly accepted the gift of greatness in the form of new territories and quietly went silent. So how did the potential threat of criminal liability prevent them from committing an act of aggression against a sovereign state? Ridiculous. Point 17. The United States and Russia will agree to extend the nuclear non-proliferation and arms control treaties, including the New START Treaty. Oh, and that's what Trump personally fears. And then there's Elon Musk. They're terrified of nuclear war. No one knows what Ukraine, its territorial integrity, and sovereignty have to do with it, but Trump needs Russia to extend this treaty. Extend a treaty that expired in 2009. We'll have a separate podcast, currently in production, about why nuclear war is currently impossible. Let's have a laugh about the rational yearning for nuclear war. Point 18. Ukraine agrees to remain a non-nuclear state in accordance with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. In theory, Ukraine could, of course, develop nuclear weapons, but it cannot do so discreetly. What's interesting here is something else. The US and Russia are afraid that Ukraine will withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ukraine has compelling grounds for withdrawal. An act of aggression was committed against it by a state that threatened both Ukraine and its allies with nuclear weapons. The allies fell for nuclear blackmail, got scared, crapped their pants, and are now forcing the victim of aggression to accept the aggressor's terms, legitimize the loss of territory, and so on. And the fact that Ukraine pledges not to withdraw from one treaty by signing a second one will mean absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, U.S. partners are already working on their own nuclear weapons. It's better to have your own weapons with a cowardly ally. Point 19. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be launched under IAEA supervision. The generated electricity will be divided equally between Russia and Ukraine, 50% each. And we hope Russia will supply the fuel for this nuclear power plant at its own expense? Point 20. Both countries commit to implementing educational programs in schools and society aimed at understanding and tolerance of different cultures and the elimination of racism and prejudice. Ukraine will implement EU rules on religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities. Both countries will agree to abolish discriminatory measures and guarantee the rights of Ukrainian and Russian media, as well as educational institutions. All Nazi ideology and activity must be rejected and prohibited. Indeed, why does everyone think this agreement was written somewhere in Moscow or by Kirill Dmitriev at Witkoff's house? All these norms have long been implemented in Ukrainian legislation. But it's hard to imagine that Russia not only opened schools with instruction in Ukrainian, but also found people willing to learn Ukrainian. The outright wads of filthy bastards left Ukraine for Russia. The same people, however, left for Ukrainian-controlled territory. Point 21. Territories. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk are recognized de facto as Russian, including by the United States. Kherson and Zaporizhzhia are frozen along the line of contact, meaning de facto recognition based on this line. Russia renounces other agreed-upon territories it controls outside the aforementioned 5 regions. Ukrainian troops will withdraw from the portion of Donetsk Oblast they currently control. This territory will become a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as Russian Federation territory. Russian troops will not enter this demilitarized zone. Well, this is clear. International law and moral norms have gone out the window. All these UN charters, the Helsinki Final Acts, the principles of the inviolability of borders, and other such nonsense are dead. If Ukraine and Europe go along with this, you can be sure there will be a war in Europe, and it will be right inside the European Union. There are too many contradictions in Europe, which are currently preventing war from escalating simply because of the formal obligation to uphold the inviolability of borders. Once a precedent for border changes is established, the issue of redrawing borders will be a matter of time. Ironically, Russia is also beginning to have disputed territories, those it included in its constitution but was unable to seize. In other words, Russia is ceasing to be a country with established borders. A member of the UN Security Council has no defined borders. But what are we talking about? We threw the UN Charter out the window. Judging by the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the unoccupied part of Donbass, one can say that nothing in this world is given away for nothing. And this isn't about mythical impenetrable fortifications, such as the cities themselves and their residential neighborhoods. It's about the simple principle: what you give up voluntarily, you can never get back. Then another ginger-haired Trump will come along and say that Russia has already owned this territory for, say, 10 years, so it should be theirs. Trump has been spouting exactly this nonsense about Crimea for the past 10 months. There is no acquisitive prescription in international law. But you can't explain this to morons. Let's take a separate look at the issue of the demilitarized zone, from which Ukrainian troops are to be withdrawn, but into which Russian troops will not be deployed. Are you serious? The National Guard, the FSB, and the police will be absent there as well? And if Russian troops do appear there, what will the US do? Like Biden, on the eve of the 2022 war, they'll say that if they fight a little, just a little, the sanctions won't be that strong, right? But the demilitarized zone and Russian control over it are needed for a very prosaic reason: access to water. With the outbreak of hostilities, Ukraine blocked the Seversky Donetsk waterway, which led to a humanitarian catastrophe by the summer of 2025. Not exactly, but those who wait for the Russian world are now using a regular plastic bag to relieve themselves because there's simply nothing to flush. And if the aggressor takes several more years, according to Western intelligence estimates, at least 2 years, to breach Ukrainian defenses in the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, by that time the entire population, which should be celebrating victory, will simply flee. Naturally, this situation doesn't affect the entire Donetsk Oblast, but Donetsk itself, along with its satellite cities of Makivka and Yenikiev, are without water and, in a couple of years, may simply cease to exist in their usual form. The population issue hasn't yet been resolved. What to do with those who don't want and won't accept Russian citizenship? What to do with those who have been living under Russian occupation for almost 4 years and are awaiting the return of Ukrainian power? Forced resettlement in the best Stalinist traditions? And we can't help but sprinkle napalm on the Zelensky's asses. Sevastopol isn't in the 5 regions listed. Both the Ukrainian and Russian constitutions recognize this city as a separate region. So, should Russian troops be withdrawn from it too and control transferred to Ukraine? That would be fair, and ridiculous. Point 22. After reaching agreements on future territorial changes, the Russian Federation and Ukraine undertake not to change them by force. If this commitment is violated, security guarantees will cease to apply. Point 23. Russia will not impede Ukraine's use of the Dnieper River for commercial purposes. An agreement on the free transportation of grain through the Black Sea will also be reached. For some reason, the Ukrainian government hasn't come up with an absolutely fair demand: a ban on the Black Sea Fleet's deployment in Crimea. The fleet hasn't been there since Ukraine sank a third of it. Russia, however, demands recognition of the realities on the ground. It's unclear why Ukraine isn't demanding the same. Zetniks would have liked it. Point 24. A humanitarian committee will be established to resolve outstanding issues. All remaining prisoners and bodies will be exchanged on an all-for-all basis. All civilian detainees and hostages, including children, will be returned. A family reunification program will be implemented. Measures will be taken to alleviate the suffering of the victims of the conflict. Point 25. Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Is this some new development in international relations, where a state's sovereignty is first confirmed and then a deadline is set? And you don't care when and how they are held? This is, after all, an internal matter for Ukraine and its citizens. Putin has been on the throne for 25 years minus 1 month, so what's stopping Zelensky from serving the same amount of time? Point 26. All parties to the conflict shall receive a full amnesty for actions committed during the war and undertake not to file claims or consider any future complaints. But this point is beyond the pale. It proposes amnesty for all those scum who shelled residential buildings and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and tortured and killed those who legitimately resisted the aggressor's occupation. In other words, it proposes pretending that Russians are completely innocent, and then issuing them 10-year visas. Point 27. This agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council, chaired by President Donald Trump. Violations will be subject to sanctions. We are now absolutely certain that peace will last until January 20, 2029. This means that no ratification of this nonsense by the United States is envisaged, which tells us that no security guarantees will work by definition. Point 28. Following the memorandum's approval by all parties, the ceasefire will take effect immediately. Both sides will withdraw to the agreed-upon positions to begin implementing the agreement. We've finally finished looking at this set of letters. It's mind-boggling. Let's sum it up. The likelihood of Ukraine signing such a document is close to zero. The likelihood of Russia signing such a document is also close to zero. After all, the US promised that no one would like its peace plan. So, it has no prospects. Even if we imagine that this entire set of letters is signed by both parties, its validity will be short-lived. No hint of ratification by the US is expected at all. The entire security structure in Ukraine will rest on the word of honor of the US president, who will be replaced in 3 years. Whether the new president will be willing to exercise his right to provide assistance to Ukraine is a question mark. The strange manner in which the plan's points are presented is also striking. This isn't due to suspicions that the original language was Russian, and the text was first translated into English, from which global news agencies then began translating into national languages. It's due to a complete misunderstanding of the principles of international law, a misunderstanding of the problems and existential nature of this war. A naivety, if you will, spiced with the ignorance and stupidity of its creators. The extension of a treaty that expired 16 years ago alone is worth a lot. And, starting in January 2025, Trump's supporters will naturally explore the world like small children, failing to understand that appeasing an aggressor has never led to peace in human history. There's also the Trump administration's strange behavior regarding the plan's origins. The plan's very appearance was essentially leaked by an unknown party. The Americans accused Ukrainian representatives of leaking the full text. Even if that were true, Ukraine acted absolutely correctly. There shouldn't have been any behind-the-scenes negotiations. Then came the statements from congressmen claiming that this plan wasn't a US plan, but a wish list for Russia. Yep, a wish list with a deadline for Ukraine to sign it in a week. That's how it works in international law and international relations, right? And the icing on the cake was Trump's own tweet, in which he doubted the plan's success. The reaction of Ukraine's main ally, Europe, deserves special consideration. News of the plan reached the pampered Europeans in South Africa while they were enjoying another summit. The first few days were filled with the usual groaning and expressions of concern. See the point about Ukraine's allies being complete crap. On Sunday, representatives from several European countries also took part in negotiations in Geneva. They even presented their own plan, which, predictably, did not satisfy Russia. And no one even noticed that, time and again, Ukraine and Europe were falling for Trump's scam and adapting to what they were given. And what they were given, remember the line with negotiating positions X and minus X, was once again proposals deliberately biased in favor of the aggressor. And the donkeys are once again agreeing to run after this carrot, because in the plan presented by Europe, it essentially agrees to recognize the occupation of part of Ukrainian territory and intends to build a new security architecture in Europe, with the participation of the OSCE, based on internationally recognized borders changed by force of arms. This is simply spectacular, of course. A spectacular nail in the coffin of Europe as an island of peace and stability. However, despite the desire of Ukraine's allies to recognize the new territorial realities, the only way for an aggressor to legitimize ownership of the stolen property is to force the victim of aggression to renounce their rights to what was taken from them. This is precisely why Russia methodically terrorizes civilians, demolishing entire high-rise buildings and shelling energy infrastructure with missiles. The biggest mystery, however, is Trump's demand that Ukraine sign a peace plan with the United States. Recall that in March 2025, there was an incredible uproar over the demand to sign an agreement on rare earth metals. Who remembers that agreement today? But back then, it gave Rusty the opportunity to tell his base that U.S. involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian war would eventually pay dividends. Since the original 28-point version envisioned economic perks for the U.S., there's a glimmer of suspicion that this was the main goal, to then gossip in every corner about the economic prosperity befalling the U.S. thanks to the wise Trump. Some bloggers are promoting the idea that, under the guise of this deal, which will be signed only between Ukraine and the U.S. wants to delve deeper into the military conflict, but we think this is a naive dream. One must always keep this axiom in mind. Rusty and his electorate are only interested in money and personal well-being. No moral principles apply. Therefore, he and his administration frankly don't care that if sanctions are lifted, Russia will immediately begin rearming and preparing for a new attack on Ukraine. They will find a pretext. And they will also learn from the mistakes of this war, believe me. However, our admin team seriously suspects that this entire plan was nothing more than a simple provocation, designed to destabilize Ukrainian society, and attempt to offer residents of Ukraine's western regions a pittance of 100 billion red purchase price in exchange for the occupied eastern regions. Combined with terror, this could yield certain results. At the same time, if Ukrainian society proves sufficiently mature and demonstrates strong unity and cohesion, Ukraine will have a fighting chance. Meanwhile, the media frenzy continues to grip both the masses and the bloggers. Everyone is already raving about Marco Rubio, portraying him as Ukraine's defender, even though they were cursing him just a few months ago. The emotional roller coaster is getting a bit tiresome. We will not recommend that Ukraine accept this plan or the plan of its European allies as an inevitable reality. Ideally, in such matters, the opinions of those Ukrainian citizens who spent all 4 years of the war on Ukrainian territory and, along with the entire country, bore the brunt of it should be taken into account exclusively. We are not some Mark Solonin, Andrei Illarionov, Mark Fegin, or Sergei Lubarsky. We do not offer advice to anyone else. Our job is to analyze, and each person must find their own way out of the global chaos. Give the podcast a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you found it interesting and want more podcasts like this one that explore the global chaos that surrounds us, and be sure to leave a comment if you have any questions or just something to say. Peace to all.